So yeah, so what we're going to talk about is why thinking about anticipating hazards in context of conflict or anticipating conflict is important in this moment. So I'm going to take you to a little bit very briefly the basics of anticipatory action and why are we talking about this topic, and then we're really going to spend a little bit more time on the fundamental aspects and sharing some of the research that I have been working on the topic. So because I saw in the poll that there are some like newcomers, like new people that is really new to this topic. So I'm going to be super briefly. We have been doing early warning systems for years. So anticipatory action per se is not necessarily like the newest thing in the world. It is innovative and it is so exciting because what we're doing is try to address those gaps in early warning and early action that we had for years. So what anticipatory action brings into the equation of the wider early warning, early action story is that we are thinking, like, how can we make sure that we can use forecast information and risk analysis in a more proactive way so we can be ahead of crisis, we're able to reduce risks, we're able to support people that is likely to be affected by different hazards in the best possible way. So when we look at anticipatory action, there are these elements that are like really key. So what we call triggers, which is basically that decision-making process, like the information and the process that help us to say, yes, I'm going to trigger my action now. Then we have the selection of actions. We need to understand what makes sense, like what can we really do before there is a shock that can actually reduce risks. And then a very important one, which is that financing mechanism. That has been one of these key aspects of a lot of the work that we have been doing over the last years, because before that was the biggest gap. There was not really a financing mechanism that could enable us to do early action. But now within the humanitarian sector, there are different financing sources that allowed humanitarian organizations to actually be able to trigger those actions and do actions before. So those are like the basics of the anticipatory action system. Now, when we think about why do we do anticipatory action in conflict? I mean, what comes to your mind, when we think about anticipatory action in conflict? So, and this is sometimes a very confusing topic. People think about this in different point of view, and these are often what comes to mind to different people. So one is, how do we make sure that we can support population that is already affected by conflict and that on top of that is very likely to be impacted by climate hazards or other hazards? So it's that anticipation in a context that is already very complex, that is very difficult, where there are populations with a lot of impacts that come from that conflict situation. At the same time, there is another point of view that is about that anticipation of conflict. How can we be better at anticipating the humanitarian impacts of conflict? So later we will be talking about these two different aspects. But the reality is that the world is a little bit more complex. So it's not like one thing and the other necessarily. I mean, what we are seeing in places like South Sudan, Mali, Palestine, just to name few, is that we're just dealing with complex crises in which we actually have the mix of the two things. And we have the situations, like I for instance, this example from Palestine, this is a picture from one of my favorite photographers called Fabio Bucanelli, is one of these war photographers. And he actually took these pictures in Gaza during a flood. So, and this was just after those attacks that happened a couple of years ago in Gaza. So it really shows that complexity, that you have populations that are leading with the impacts of conflict. On top of that, get like a flood or a storm. And then at the same time, follows by an escalation of conflict. So it's that absolutely mix of complexity, which is exactly what we are seeing in Mali, what we are seeing in South Sudan. And we were just seeing clearly for example, in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa. So the complexity of the interaction between the impacts of COVID, the multiple rainy, faily seasons, escalation of conflict from different factions of Al-Shabaab, and other many things, because we have that complexity. So I think that the big question for us when we think about anticipatory action in conflict is how can we develop those decision-making processes that can help us to say, okay, I'm going to trigger action. I'm going to be able to reduce certain risk based on our forecast information. So, and the basics, like, well, what do we care? I mean, why it really matters to really think about conflict and people affected by conflict. I mean, I think for many of you here that are practitioners or researchers and know, I mean, it's very natural. And I'm from Colombia. I have seen the impacts of conflict and the absolutely massive displacement of populations that often, like in the case of Colombia, it was very common that you have population that displaced because of the conflict. Where do they go to live? In the most high-risk areas, where normally they are exposed to mudslides, landslides, etc., etc. So we have like that dynamic and those kind of like growing exposure in the world. So that's kind of one of these elements that if we think about the future of the humanitarian sector in a context of climate change and that fragility, we need to be ready to be able to be smarter, to use the different kind of like science, social science, climate science that we have around to anticipate such crises. So now let's go deep a little bit more in these fundamentals. And a little bit, I'm really excited to share some of the research that I have been doing recently. This is quite, yeah, I find it fascinating. So just to get us started, I always like to show the disaster risk management continuum, because it really shows where the anticipatory action window fits. And so we see that this is not like a single, anticipatory action is not the single solution that will solve all the problems of the world, but it's just part of the puzzle. And of course, our priority big one is like the long-term investment on tackling the root causes of disasters and like making sure that we have the proper adaptation to climate change that is in place. Anticipatory action, what does is to manage that residual risk. Like, well, what can we do to at least kind of like reduce those risks that were not managed in the long term? And then we have, of course, our emergency response window and then response recovery rehabilitation, which are other big opportunity for climate action. So if we look at the different elements in detail of anticipatory action in conflict or in general anticipatory action, so we have these very important things. So the fundamentals are understanding risk, to know who is likely to be impacted, what is likely to be impacted and why. And then like really understanding that forecast availability and monitoring. And this could be different type of forecast, like climate forecast, other hazard forecast. The story of like conflict forecast comes into the equation as well. Then those communication channels, like how do we transfer the warning messages to the right people at the right time with the right message in the best way? And then this early action planning is like, what can we do that really makes sense, that is fit for purpose to the context, that applies certain principles that particularly in a context of conflict is conflict sensitive, that make sure that we're not just making the situation worse. So our team later on will talk a little bit about these details. And then that financing system landscape. So I'm just going to dig down a little bit in some of these aspects. So I just finished a big literature review of all the academic research in 20 countries affected by conflict, like really looking at like where the research is happening and what are the topics that are prioritized in this framework of early warning. So this might not be a surprise for many of you, but it's kind of like shocking. So we have like out of the 400 and something papers that I analyzed, the distribution is like this. Most of the analysis is on the hazard analysis, on the forecast availability, but it's very, very little research on the actual action planning, on the capacity of delivery, on that communication of messages, and very importantly, on that understanding risk element, which is fundamental, not only in the context of conflict, but in any other context. And the financing, like very, very tiny. And as you see, there is also a very interesting distribution of countries of where that research had happened. So we have like a big research in Ethiopia, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, but in countries that are like really like very complex situations, there is very, very little research. And that might reflect as well a little bit what is happening in reality in terms of practice. Also, there is analysis of like, what is the type of research in terms of the hazards that are studied. So the majority, no surprise, is rainfall, precipitation, flood, and drought. That's where most of the research is happening. Now, as understanding risk is one of the fundamental aspects to be able to know how to do anticipatory action, I always like to refer to this picture, which is very impactful. It is a family in Gaza after a flood, after the attacks like happened. And it really raises a lot of questions. Is what can we do in the context of humanitarian action or research or practice or development to avoid that these kind of things happen? Like, there are so many risks that we can unpack from this picture. And I think one of these big questions is how can we make sure that we can support communities in a way that we can reduce these risks. So one of the ideas that are coming up of things that a lot of different organizations are working on is like, how do we analyze risk on a more complex way? Like all this idea of compound risk analysis, which we're very passionate about in the Climate Center, is very important. It's really trying to bring all these different indicators to understand who is more likely to be impacted and what the legacy of conflict has had in that creation of risk. And for that, we have tools like this forensic investigation of disasters, which, for instance, my colleague Tessie has been leading on in Honduras, try to understand how the systematic violence that happens in a context like Honduras has actually a massive implication in the creation of risk and how we can translate that into the anticipatory action process. Now, other piece of research that I have done is looking into the question of the forecast, because one of the big myths that sometimes exists is that, oh no, but in some contexts, we cannot use forecasts. There are no really forecasts for floods or droughts or cold waves and these kind of things. So I was asking a question. I wanted to do a historical analysis of the most impactful events in 20 countries, in particular regions that have been affected by conflict, and try to understand if those disasters that were very impactful were forecast and at what extent. So we can have a little bit of a very narrative. So the conclusion of that study, which is very, very interesting. So 62% of all the events were actually very good forecasted. So early action could have happened if an anticipatory action system was in place to be able to reduce the risk that happened in those specific disasters, particularly the reduce of mortality, which was one of the biggest impacts in many of those disasters that I analyzed. 32% of those were forecast with some extent, not with the highest probability, but anyways, that is the kind of decisions that are important for us to make of what is the risk that we can take in extremely fragile situations to be able to do some early action. And only 4% of the events were actually not forecast. So that's a little bit of the story. Then a little bit of the the early action part. I'm gonna let this to my colleague Evan, who has been really researching about this topic, but I think this is a topic that is very important of looking at what are those populations that are super high risk and what can we do? And I think this issue of anticipatory action in context of camps, refugee camps, IDP camps, it comes very strongly and is very important, and we have a big gap there. On the financing side, I just wanted to share two important things just to give you a little bit of an idea of where we are on the financial picture. In general, in contexts affected by conflict, based on our research that we did for the IPCC, for the last report, there is basically the systematic assessment of evidence concludes that there is a massive gap of adaptation efforts and adaptation investment in countries affected by conflict. So we can see that, so we don't have an assessment of the financing for early action per se. So there is no research in the world that is looking into that detail per se, but we see clearly that we know that disaster risk reduction efforts, climate change adaptation efforts, particularly that financing aspect is very, very limited in contexts that are not very complex. And to analyze a little bit more in depth, recently, together with the International Committee of the Red Cross and ICPA, Mercy Corps, and many others, we also came up with a little bit of an understanding of like what are all these gaps of financing in conflict settings. So I welcome you to really check out this document, because it has a lot of really rich information on the topic. So now, just to finalize, because I know I think I'm at the top of my time, if you ask me, I mean, what could be these recommendations? What do we need to do if we want to advance that set up of anticipatory action for people affected by conflict? One of the, I think the key elements that we have is this focus on camps. So Evan is going to take you through that later. But I think very importantly, something that is really coming into many of the discussions that we have within the anticipatory action community is that need to develop in this decision-making process that not focus on a single moment of time of risk, but that monitor risk over time. So because we know that in a conflict context, it is not that just one thing happened one day, but we know the fluctuation of many things that happen. So I think having that capacity to take decisions over time is extremely important. And we do need to develop the systems and methodologies to be able to do that more systematically. The element, the gap that we see on early action planning is quite big. And from the research perspective, as you saw in my slides, but also on the practice. And I think Kim is going to take you through some examples that are very interesting of some work that FAO is doing. And as well, this element of financing mechanisms. But there are, like the last point, which I think is very interesting, is in terms of the hazards that also we look, if we just look in climate in particular, there is very, very little like efforts from the research and application on extreme temperatures and like sandstorms, for example, and being extreme temperatures and heat waves, one of these hazards that are going to be just very, very hard in some contexts. And we're not ready for it to anticipate. So I think that's one of those big priorities. So I'm going to leave it like that for the moment. Thank you so much. Really looking forward for the questions, and over to you, Tessie and Nikki.